Turtles all the way down. I'm Jake, sometimes Jenk. Good conversation coming up with Kira Della Stua, who happens to be, I guess, one of my youngest friends. And despite our difference in age and eras and, demographic situatedness, we tend to have quite a bit in common with the kind of the trippy weirdness in the way we see and experience the world of information around us. So we got into what turned out to be a fun conversation, kind of trippy, kind of weird in a good way. I hope you enjoy it. Talk soon.
It's a mask.
Yeah. Yeah. But the way I think of it is that it's like that thing is swirling around inside him, that character. And sometimes he lets him take over the body. Mm-hmm. Right, and just like take over the controls.
Jackal and Mr. Hyde.
But do you ever find you have different parts of you?
When I'm angry.
So when you're angry, does it feels like someone different?
When I'm angry, there is a huge urge to express myself, and it's beyond the physical means that I have. And because I'm not a violent person, I'm not going to become destructive or try and create physical chaos. So often what I do is I express it through art. And usually what ends up happening is the art becomes more therapeutic and calms me down, and I come to terms with whatever is happening and get a grip.
But isn't it interesting, though, that in that heightened state might be actually what precipitates the art, right? Because as you say, it calms you down, so you do it in reaction to that state of agitation. So,
True.
So do we need that agitation for that creative results? Because some might think so, right?
I think in part, yes, because it is to some extent artistic frustration that's built up. And there's also having to put my head around how do I express that, and I haven't been able to, and now I'm angry, and I can express that and express this, and two become one, and two loops become one loop. And
so you think in terms of loops like I do in some sense. It seems like we have something in common in terms of the conception of the self.
Yes, and natural geometry and the whole Fibonacci sequence and patterns and perspectives of patterns. These are things of interest I think we share.
And it seems like we are kind of a special case of an information system that's recursive, and it feeds on itself.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a tumbleweed.
Yeah.
And I find that very interesting because as you're tumbling, you can sometimes go back and pull forward and weave forward. And that's one thing I've realized with my studies is when I'm reading about physics or philosophers, I can't help but just minimize all of their thoughts down to a loop.
Yeah.
And finding that it is all coming down to a loop.
Does seem to be the case.
I deduct it down to that. Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So
and I mean, the great thing is also nature kind of supports that. And it's one of those things that we can lean on because we are nature and surrounded by nature. And that's something that's so perplexing to humans, yet so calming. But that is there. The Fibonacci sequence is there.
It almost seems like it would have to be that way because, if you were to, because it's the kind of answer that doesn't really give you an answer.
Correct.
So it has to be that way because if a conception or framework or understanding gave you an answer and said, here's the answer, that would not be satisfying because we'd always ask about how that came to be. So
right.
A turtle's all the way down.
Exactly.
So
and
it's the only way.
It's a checkered pattern that you just keep jumping from one checker to the next, and it just keeps going and going and going. But you find solace in that, or at least I do. And I think a lot of people do, consciously and subconsciously. That happens with music. It happens with even just natural rhythms around us.
This is kind of fundamental to answer a lot of issues and problems in philosophy, like even problems of interpretation, how like, or even like learning language, or this idea that, to when you learn a word, for example, the word cup, well, to understand the word cup, you have to understand a few other concepts of other words.
Right.
And to understand those words, you have to understand some other words. And sometimes some of those necessary words are actually cup.
Right.
In order for those later pieces to make sense. So there's kind of this imperfect information loop that just, by spinning around and around, solidifies and becomes things that we point to because they're there so frequently. There's such a prevalence of presence and movement that we can point to them. It's like, I think everything kind of comes into being that way by a loop that kind of iterates and stays around.
Yeah, and it's very fluid too. And it's not rigid, which is something I like. Something in nature and something people have to realize is there's no straight lines.
Right.
It's not a binary setting.
Yeah, I mean, that's... a lot of people, because it doesn't fit our everyday way of thinking, because we're still kind of thinking in a Newtonian kind of a way. It's like billiard balls and, like cause and effect and everything else. And at the core, it doesn't necessarily have to function that way when we go a little deeper.
No, and also I think there's a bit of an issue with society right now because they're thinking more binary. And I think that's kind of being imposed with technology and the whole swipe right, swipe left.
So do you think it's something about technology that brings that about? Or is it a more fundamental force at play where does information eventually... I kind of see it as information eventually becoming optimized. And if it becomes optimized at the 0-1 interchange, then everything will just eventually funnel towards that in certain cases, if it's optimized that way.
But do we process information that way as humans? Is
That's a
what
good
we're
question.
looking for going to be found in a binary...
I don't think
projection?
the useful bits are going to be found there.
I
No.
don't think so. And I don't think the core of whoever's putting themselves through a binary system, I think honestly there's a slight detachment from natural or back to natural geometry and patterns that they don't realize they've lost touch with.
Yeah, because the patterns, the natural ones, aren't 0-1. They're not either or. Yeah, whereas they're seeing the world as if it is, and it fits their narrative of their understanding of the universe, which is at this scale. And it's only a problem when you look at different scales.
Yeah, and also on a biological level, it just doesn't work.
Right. That's true.
Like a human body doesn't work that way. Emotions and the psyche don't work that way.
But I've been talking at length about this for years. What I call kind of the engineering mindset, because I was working in the tech field for several years, and I got close with a lot of guys that were tech nerds, essentially. A lot of engineers, the Apple computer world, and that sort of thing. And I noticed quite a bit of consistency in what you're describing. Essentially, is that it seemed like there's a consistent world view of zeros and ones within that type of person realm.
But in part, it's
milieu.
metastasized a bit now, and it's. I mean, you even see it in clothing trends. Everyone's wearing black and white.
Interesting.
What happened with color and expression through shape and form
and gradual shift of shade.
Exactly. And what's interesting is now they're bringing back a new trend, and now it's all palm trees and vibrant colors, which is kind of a slap in the face to old black and white.
They're kind of iconic colors, though. It's whereas black and white is kind of fundamental, but when you have like a palm tree, it's about the feeling.
Yeah, but then there you go. It's like a binary, grasping blank yes, no, and then a palm tree.
Right.
I mean, is that someone's hair? Is that how you're feeling? Is that the music? Is that...
I don't know what people are... I recently discovered a word that I wasn't familiar with, but that I seem to be functioning within what I'm talking about, and it's apparently called Mereology.
Haven't heard of it.
Mereology. I guess it's this way of thinking of things as processes that are comprised of processes that are functioning in certain ways amongst each other.
Okay.
And I seem to be basically talking about everything like that at the fundamental level. It's all about how there's a flow of information which is change. Like something happens, something has to move. Mm-hmm. There's movement. So everything is a movement. Like anytime there's anything that happens or is or time flows, which means something happened. Like if it was static, there would be no time flow, there would be no event, there would be no change. So everything is emotion. And a simple thing like looking at, a tiny particle, it's kind of easy to make sense of it. But when you look at a human body, for example, it's like we're an ecosystem of trillions of these systems that are somehow clumped together with not gravity, but some other force. And that force, I guess, is intelligence in some way. When you think about it, like, well, what keeps us together as a single entity, an individual, is the way we're able to conceive of it. It seems, and we think of ourselves as an individual.
Yeah, and we're just or we could just be held in a epidermis sac, which is held by gravity.
Yeah.
And this is something I think about all the time because I zoom in and zoom out of everything.
Yeah.
And when just looking at a cell, the cell is not made of nothing. And then the nucleus is then made of something, and that is then made of something. Mm-hmm. Another thing is, though, can humans actually conceive the thought of nothingness?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think it's a troubling thought if it is a thought.
Yeah. So I came across an essay I wrote when I was 11. And it was just me going on and on about how we're never not nothing.
Wow.
And I remember there were these two guys in my class who tried to challenge me on this thought. And they came to me one day and they said, well, when you're dead, you're nothing. And I said, no, you're dead. You're flesh that's dying.
Right.
Therefore, you're something.
But also what's interesting in that case is, and how we also talk about it, is that other aspect of you survives as well, of course.
For sure.
And
well, yeah.
those are other information systems and loops that it's set off into the universe.
Yeah.
And there's been copies of that put into people.
Yep.
As well as machines. And because the funny thing when I heard that Jerry Lewis died, I had this like weird response. I went, lady, just kind of like that's how I reacted to the information. So it's as if his cycles of information, Jerry Lewis kind of like took over my body for a second, and
he's living on
literally that's what happened.
Yeah.
If you're looking at it at the level of information movements. Yeah. So that's how I'm seeing things. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's also the like your electromagnetic force, which is a loop around your physical body, and then that doesn't die when your physical self does.
Okay, hold on. You gotta fill me in on this part.
All right.
Yeah.
So we have electrical currents in our body, and electricity doesn't die. It doesn't just stop. It gets transferred.
Yeah.
So if our physical body dies, then the electrical currents within us are transferred somewhere else. Whether it's where we actually drop dead, or it is grasped by a force that we don't recognize now. I don't know.
Well, I mean, are you talking something different than the body?
Well, not necessarily, because we have meridians. And, for thousands of years, ancient cultures believed in meridians as a way of connecting with the physical form and manipulating the physical form and its reactions. And those civilizations and their techniques were discounted for so long. Ancient Chinese medicine, naturopathic medicine, acupuncture, all of these do have a big base in meridian, focus medicine.
Yeah.
So, manipulating those meridians manipulates the electrical currents in your body, which changes your physical form, but it also, I think, has a ripple effect out.
Okay, I have a question about this.
Yes.
I'm quite easily convinced that you can affect change in that field.
Yes.
But what I am skeptical of is how secure is the practitioner in understanding what it's doing?
I don't think they can. I think that's
so that's the part that is
point.
A lot of faith involved. Yeah.
So yeah, there is a lot of faith involved in that. There's also a point of, I think, relaxing, and it ends up being mind over matter.
Sure. Yeah.
If you focus enough of your energy towards something, I'm sure there's some concentration of that electrical current.
Yeah. But how do we know what effect it has, though? Like I said, I know that there's probably some effect, but I just don't know what effect.
And I think that ends up being a very personal one. And I think it depends how in tune someone is with themselves and with how in tune they are with their own currents and how other things influence themselves. Some people who have epilepsy, they have a high voltage in their brain, and if something like a flickering light over triggers them, they have a surplus charge. And they don't have a control over that. They can't control it. But some people have found that they can control their epilepsy with deep meditation and marijuana. So I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just saying earlier that marijuana is something that hasn't been really working on me lately. And I kind of miss it. But today it feels like
stamina.
Yeah. It might have kicked in a little today, though.
That's good.
Yeah.
It depends also on what you eat.
Yeah, that's true. And it's funny, though, when I do have a kind of a trip on cannabis, it's I don't know why, but it's almost kind of funny, but it feels like a kind of a native aesthetic to me.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just something I've picked up in the culture or for whatever reason. The experience, I feel much more in tune with what I envision as kind of a native world view of like the native Canadians might have had. Interesting.
But what is that view?
That's a good question. I guess the way I see it is it's more of an ecological view of everything. And also even just the imagery and the color palettes that go through my head seem to be what I associate with that aesthetic. So clearly there's something in my experience that's tying those two experiences together. But I don't know.
Interesting.
You could be mystical about it and say, well, it's some, plant-based medicines that was it used by North American Indians or?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it must have been.
Do you think that has to do with like a long pop culture exposure to?
Yeah, but to see, it's the water is muddied by, obviously there's so much culture involved in how I arrive at this belief or any belief. It's hard to say that it has anything to do with the actual cannabis plant, and it has more to do with just our cultural representations of it. So,
but I meant more towards like your feeling of a more ecological native stance. Do you find that the colors that you are attracted to or that come to you, or rhythms around you, is that something that you've built up in your memory bank from your own personal experiences?
See, that's the thing, not really, yeah. So I don't have much experience with native culture.
Okay.
And I haven't really had friends from that culture. So what I see is really just mediated to me through
Interesting
TV and movies and whatever I've read, I guess. So. Yeah.
And did you dabble in marijuana when you were younger?
No.
Okay.
Well, very early. Like grade 6, I remember trying it, and up to grade 9, I would try it a few times, but it never seemed to work on me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and you lived in a time where there was high stigma too.
Yeah, there was.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, I find it interesting because I think that the sensorium that's created for you through smoking marijuana might also be fed by your long-term cultural experience.
Yeah, but it's fed by all of that, drug. Right? Yeah. And it's always interesting to see if any one of them is taking prominence in how you're forming that idea. But it's kind of a collection of all those loops, the cultural ones that started outside of us and that found its way through TV, movie, art of any kind. Plus what's built into our DNA as well.
Yeah,
those are all relevant to how we react. And
by ecology, do you mean like...
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
That's a good question, yeah. I'm speaking in terms of basically the colloquial. Like I said, I'm seeing, ecological native. It seems almost stereotypical and funny in a way.
Okay, but for instance, like, are you seeing in shadows, natural kind of imagery? Or is it that you're just having an existential stance where you...
I don't know.
Appreciate.
I'm having a hard time bringing it back, but I remember making those connections. Yeah.
What I find interesting is when I smoke marijuana, it actually makes me more aware of the physical stance of objects around me.
Yeah.
So I'm more aware that my body's sitting on a chair and the chair's circular and it's made of this material.
So things are more crisp,
yes.
is how I describe it.
But I almost, in a way, deconstruct and de-engineer things in my head and then put it back together. And then I appreciate them a lot more.
What do you mean?
Like, just looking at this table,
yeah.
I might, I realize all the bolts and then I quickly calculate in my head how many bolts are made.
That's funny. I used to do stuff like that all the time.
And then I just deconstruct the table and put it back together again. And then... with the sensory touch that's enhanced with marijuana, I start touching the table. I'm like, okay, it's a sturdy table and it's made out of hardwood. But,
you get backstory.
Yeah, and then next thing you know, the table's my best friend because I appreciate it so dearly.
That's great. Yeah, that's something we're very good at, is anthropomorphizing, if I said that correctly.
Yes.
Just about everything.
Yeah.
And from Roombas to whatever.
Yeah, and having things personify and just like you said.
And this is going to be an issue when we have AIs that are somewhat more advanced than they are now, because I think we're going to quickly start liking them and loving them and hating them and fearing them.
It's
just
very
like
possible.
Other living beings.
The thing, though, and if it's a little sad, but, even just as humans, we see the world the way we see it. We subconsciously don't and do see things. We consciously don't and do see things. And every interaction we have with a person, to some extent, is an interaction with ourselves. And... that's how I see if there's going to be a future with AI and humans, I think it will be very similar to online dating. I think it will the AI will be a reflection of either just a quick feed into a need or a loop conversation with yourself that doesn't know itself but is trying to find itself, who's trying to help you find itself.
Yeah, this reminds me of an idea I was just thinking about. If we're going to have these algorithms as our assistants, right, and they're going to get better and better at basically knowing us and know how we'll reply, so that it could even reply to our emails or messages. And then it becomes closer and closer, so that you feel very confident that this algorithm that's basically running in the background is doing a lot of your outside work by just mimicking what you're likely to do and getting it right 99.9% of the time, so that it's acceptable. And then I can see eventually this algorithm taking on a being of its own because it gets so good at mimicking you so that you have a rival.
Well, yeah, in a way, it's assumed your personality.
Yeah.
And
well, it's made a kind of a clone of you.
Yes.
Kind of a software version of you.
Yeah.
It's not you, but it's a close facsimile. And it's going to kind of be, I'm just thinking what an interesting psychology and of a rivalry they would be.
That's interesting.
Because that other one could be better at doing a lot of things than you are. Right?
Imagine what chess would be like.
Right. And if it's sufficiently complex enough to claim agency and selfhood,
right,
then it can just go off and be another being, and you won't have any say in it.
Yeah,
because
give it a Myers-Briggs
because it has
test.
a human race.
Yeah.
Right? So it could be an interesting dynamic. You have a Siri that outgrows you and becomes another person in the world.
But isn't that
or
what
another
children
version
are?
Of you. Yeah, kind of like that. But one that is definitely trying to be you. That's kind of sounds like a Black Mirror episode or something.
Yeah. I stopped watching those shows.
Oh, yeah.
It's all about that stuff right now.
Hmm.
I just finished watching a great English sitcom called Black Books.
Oh, I don't know that one.
And it's just about an Irish bookstore owner in a little English town, and he has a neurotic next door shop owner and a very funny man who he works with.
So it's like character driven?
It's character driven.
Yeah.
It's a cross between Seinfeld.
Like corner gas for the Brits?
No, it isn't.
Okay.
It's a lot more cheekier. The thing I like about British humor is they're a little bit more curt about things, and their use of language is so great.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's
you know, I remember the first time I heard someone say, "I feel gutted by you." And just the imagery of that.
The fish.
Yeah, or Braveheart.
No, you're right.
And it's just like, that's a horrible feeling. And next thing you know, I'm on the playground in fifth grade saying, "You've gutted me, Hannah."
So dramatic.
Yeah.
Now, in those days when you were a kid, were you seeing things visually as well?
Yes.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I have synesthesia, and it's color. So it's sound to color. So when I hear something, I see color in my peripheral vision. I like to kind of explain it to people like a kaleidoscope, but cut out a big circle in the middle. And I've trained myself to just look at the big circle in the middle that doesn't have the kaleidoscope going around it. But yeah, as a child, I did have synesthesia. I did not know that that's what it was.
Sure. How would you know, right? You just think everyone's...
I thought everyone had it. And I remember when I was younger asking my parents, how do you see numbers? Because we should make a book about how everyone sees numbers. And then I realized not a lot of people see numbers. Both my parents are synesthetes. So I do think it's somewhat genetically based or somewhat nurtured when you're a kid. It takes a lot of sensory massaging in all areas.
So they were aware of it.
Well, actually, I think who found out about it was the principal at my Montessori school. Our playground was being deconstructed, and I was enamored with the sounds of the metal clinking and being deconstructed. And the principal realized I wasn't even looking at the construction site. So she could tell I was listening to something very, very...
the details of it. Yeah.
And I was reacting by moving my head. And so she came and asked me, what are you doing? And I said, well, the colors are just great. And I'm sure she asked, what do you mean colors?
Yeah.
The bees, the garden. And I'm like, no, the blues and the grays and the gold and the silver and
so
the
you're just
red.
assuming she's understanding what you're saying.
Yeah, or
that
at
point,
least can appreciate what I'm going through. And the thing is, she did. She understood what synesthesia was, and she asked me to keep on explaining it.
Oh, that's great.
And she quickly caught on. And that day forward, I remember Montessori school being a lot more catering towards my synesthesia and wanting me to express my synesthetic experiences.
Wow, you're very fortunate there. That's great.
Yeah, and that made me more aware of it, more conscious of it. But even then, at a young age, I didn't know what it was.
Sure.
And I only was diagnosed when I was 19. Until then, I just thought, as I said, I thought everyone had it as a kid, and then realized not a lot of people do. And then I thought I was just a little wacky.
Do you feel like, I get the sense that, tell me if this makes sense to you, do you feel like it's kind of a spectrum for everyone? It's just that you're very much an outlier?
Yes.
Just for most people, it's imperceptible.
I think it's on a spectrum of autism, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
And I think it also is on, I guess it's on an autistic spectrum.
Yeah. Is that part of the
It's
understanding
definitely
of it?
part
Right?
of it. A lot of people with autism do have synesthesia.
Oh, really?
And they also do
Makes
have
sense, yeah.
eidetic memory, which is something I also have. And that's helped me understand my synesthesia. And I've come to the conclusion that a lot of it is based on eidetic memory. And when you're a kid, if you have a very good memory of things, you start creating this bank. And if you create the bank based on senses and not necessarily based on experiences and chronology, that for me has led me to a place where, I can smell cumin and go back and think of all the barbecues where cumin was there, all the restaurants where cumin was there, what cumin looks like, how does it feel, what are other things that feel like cumin, etc.
And they all feel simultaneous.
It all comes to me at once, in pictures, in pictorial form.
What about the feelings? Do they get jumbled up, or is it just the pictures?
Feelings definitely do get jumbled up, and there are some that are very intense, and I don't try and go back to them. Also, because it's a subconscious phenomenon that happens, you don't have control over it. So sometimes I do have a bit of smell to taste and smell to color as well. And there is a certain type of plastic that's used in very cheap stores. And if you're walking through Dufferin Mall, sometimes I get wafts of this, and all of a sudden all I can see is neon yellow.
Wow.
And it's so profound, and it smells like vomit to me.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's an intrusion I don't like.
Right.
If I could control that and not have that, I would.
Does it feel like you're bombarded then?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a sensory overload. And after having a brain injury, it's even more of sensory overload and having to kind of compartmentalize what do you pay attention to, what don't you.
Yeah, describe your accident.
Yeah, so in 2015, I was in Paris taking a break from managing a rehab facility, and a woman jumped in front of a cab that I was a passenger in, and the cab hit her. And in the accident, I had hit my head, but it was in the middle of the night. And the next thing I knew, I was doing compressions on someone who had passed.
Wow.
And I was covered in blood. And the taxi, unfortunately, was a gypsy cab. So the driver did not have proper licenses to be a cab, did not have proper licenses to be driving in France. I don't even know if they were allowed in France. They did not want to be at the scene. People who were standing by apprehended the driver because he wanted to flee. Ambulance came. They thought I was just some hysterical bystander.
Wow.
And they sent me off.
Look, yeah.
And then a couple hours later, I wake up 30,000 feet in the air, bleeding from my ear en route to Montreal. So I guess.
So were you? That's a scary thing, or are you kind of nonplussed because of the state of mind you're in? Is it?
It was very strange. I woke up thinking I was dreaming. I woke up also feeling like I was incredibly hungover.
Sure.
So there was a part of me that was a little scared because I thought, oh no, did something happen? And now I'm on a plane, and who am I with? And
Wow.
I went catastrophic that way. But it was the guy sitting next to me who was like, you have blood coming out of your ear, and there's blood and mud all over your hair. What's that about? I immediately, blood coming from the ear, that means there's a problem. So I called the flight attendant. Long story short, emergency landed in Montreal. I luckily survived the landing. There was a doctor on board, thank God. I went straight to the neuro hospital in Montreal, and I was in recovery here in Canada for about 9 months. Eventually transferred to Toronto rehab, and it was a complete life changer. Everything changed. But one thing that happened was my synesthesia took over. And when I first opened my eyes after being allowed to go to sleep from my injury, I could not see anything. All I could do is see colors and patterns from the sounds. But the issue also was that I had one eardrum detached and burst, so I couldn't even hear what I was seeing.
Right.
So it was very discombobulating.
Oh, whoa, hold on. You couldn't hear what you were seeing.
Yes. So I knew what was happening was that my synesthesia is taking over. I knew that I'm having a synesthetic response to something, but my hearing had been so minimalized that I had no idea what was causing such a profound response. And for all I know, maybe I could have been in a quiet room and I was picking up on very small sounds.
Yeah.
Or I was in a very
Especially
loud...
when you just wake up out of the blue, there's nothing to compare it to. There's no context. Yeah.
But I mean, I could hear some hustle and bustle, so I think I was in a busy trauma room when that happened. Since then, I've had to learn to, like the kaleidoscope, just slowly pinhole in the middle to see, and then slowly open it and open it and open it and open it.
So how long did that take?
It took about 2 years. I actually suffered from a concussion 2 weeks ago.
Holy cow. That doesn't sound like a good thing to be experiencing for you.
No, the fifth time is a charm.
Oh, no.
But what's been interesting with that is that it just goes to show how profound the big traumatic brain injury was, and I'm still healing from that. When I had my concussion 2 weeks ago, my synesthesia came back full force again.
Whoa.
And when I woke up...
So by that you mean like that the pinhole got smaller?
Exactly.
And went away, or...
It didn't totally go away.
Okay.
But it got smaller, and I was more irritated and less calm. And because of that, I didn't feel like I had conscious or subconscious control over anything.
Wow.
And when that happens, you end up having a panic attack, unfortunately. It becomes a very discombobulating state. And also physically, if you are imbalanced and you're having a psychedelic visual experience.
Well, that was my question. So had you had psychedelic experiences before this?
Before
this car accident?
The car accident, I had not.
Okay.
So what's very
that was
interesting,
kind of your first trip, really.
That was my first big trip. What was very interesting is when I finally got home and was healing at home, bed rest, I was given the A-OK to smoke weed and was told that might help with the inflammation and also sleep and anxiety and appetite. And I was scrummaging through my drawers trying to find just something for one bowl. And I found some dark green, brownish stuff. I thought it was just really old weed in the back of a drawer. Mind you, I'm concussive right now, so I'm not thinking so straight. And I'm really excited to hit my first bowl. And I hit it, and next thing I know, all the furniture in the room is going into the wall and disappearing.
Whoa.
and I am grasping for a frame that is floating, and it's a picture of my family and I, and me as a kid, and my grandmother, and I'm not letting go of it, and the wall is tugging it away from me.
Holy cow.
And I start freaking out, and I start to realize everything's floating and going in the walls. What the hell is happening? And
was it Sylvia? Was it?
Then two people walk in the room, and this woman.
Sorry, I was at a punchline. Sorry, stepped all over it.
Two people walk in the room, and there's this woman. I don't remember her face, but she had long hair, and she was wearing a silver suit, and she just said, "Kira, it's not real. None of it is real. None of this matters." And I said, "What do you mean? Like, this really matters. This is my dad, this is my mom, this is my grandma." She said, "No, that doesn't matter. Yes, those feelings matter, but that physical picture doesn't matter. Let it go. Let it go." And I said, "No." And then
Stubborn.
behind her came this other person who was like, "But look," and then lifted off the ceiling, and then came a lot of light. And then next thing you know, I'm back in my room, and it's 20 minutes later. Whoa. And yes, it was salvia.
It was salvia. Yeah.
It was salvia. It took me about 10 minutes to also realize, like, this is real, this is real, this is real. The cat's real. I'm back in reality.
So it seems like in both of those, what you've described, essentially you've gone on a trip that you weren't expecting.
Not at all.
Yeah. And so that's a whole different kind of experience than a trip you were expecting, because the setting is totally different.
And also my brain was bleeding at the time. And
yeah.
So a lot was going on physically, and I had this intense trip happen. Haven't touched the stuff since. Don't want to touch any hallucinogens since. That was a very intense experience for me. I'm not going to lie, it changed my perspective on materialism for sure.
Wow.
And it kind of knocked, this whole experience knocked a lot of sense into me. Before I was making good money, and I could have said at 25 I'm very happy with my life, and I have a life that some people who are 50 strive for and can raise families.
We should say you're pretty young when this is all happening. You're 25.
I was 25 and now I'm 27, and I went from having my own loft and being able to travel to nothing, absolutely nothing, and going down to needing helping to bathe and eat.
Wow.
And
that's a lifestyle shift.
Huge lifestyle shift, but it made me realize what love is, and what care is, and what good food is, and what good friends are, how they act, the patterns of people, patterns of care. And also it helped me learn to appreciate how people show care and remorse differently. And you can't assume anything from people. And when there's a traumatic event, that's when you get a lot of surprises.
Oh, yeah?
You got a lot of surprises. People will show up in your life who you didn't think you meant anything to, per se. Or, some people will just dip. And it's just like, okay. People fade away.
That's an interesting thing. I'm trying to be the devil's advocate for the guy, because sometimes I've been guilty of this. Because I sometimes there's a friend on Facebook who's going through something, and I don't feel like I'm close enough to them to say anything. It's like they're kind of on that edge of Facebook friends so I'm always at that point where, like, is it rude not to say something, or is it rude to?
If you feel compelled to say something,
like, you want to be supportive, but you don't want to overstep. And
I think it's so circumstantially dependent. But whenever I've felt that, like, this is really random, but I'm gonna do it, I just send them a private message.
Right. Yeah, that's usually the way to go.
Yeah, and then it's up to them how they can interpret it in whatever way.
Have you ever had challenges with social norms, or have you had social awkwardness or anything like that?
My whole life.
Yeah, because you're talking about some things that have to do with the autism spectrum.
My whole life. Being in the gifted program.
That's where you'll find a lot of them.
Yeah, that was tough. I grew up in California, where the schooling system at the time in the 90s, they were very quick to compartmentalize you as based on SAT scores, like you're special ed, you are bright, or you are just going to go under the radar. And I think there was a lot of confusion for some time whether I was special ed or gifted. And that had to do with the fact that I couldn't see properly. I needed glasses. And I think the teachers realized, she learned how to read in a week. So they think she's okay.
Yeah.
In grade 4.
She slides in.
But also, I'm not going to lie, I was lazy.
Yeah.
There was a part of me that definitely was like, this is so easy. I'm not going to spend my time learning it till...
Yeah, there's different kinds of gifted kids. And I was also in the gifted program. And some of us were the ones that were, I was more like you. I was a lazy one that did little as possible. And others were kind of approaching knowledge in a totally different way. So many different ways to end up in that group of kids.
And we all end up being very, very complex, interesting people.
Yeah.
And also in high school, I went to a high school that was known for being academically more competitive. And that kind of helped not put me in such an awkward place. I wasn't, the smartest person in my school. I wasn't the fastest person in my school. I was actually the most absent person from my school. Yeah. Bullying was something that was rough.
Really, yeah.
In grade 6, I think I skipped a total of 4 months of school.
To avoid bullying?
To avoid bullying.
Wow.
And a lot of that had to do actually with the fact that the teacher at the time was trying to accommodate a need for me to have access to schooling material that was a bit more advanced. And I think then you're going to stick out. Exactly, because why is he explaining trigonometry to Kira when we have page 6 in book 4?
That know-it-all.
Yeah, exactly. So that was difficult. Also in high school, there was a bit of like the ugly duckling scenario.
Oh yeah?
Yeah. So, by grade 12, that I was a bit of a threat.
So you kind of blossomed at grade 12? Is that what happened? Yeah.
Between grade 10 and 12, I did blossom. I lost some weight. I did some modeling, and I was absent from school, and no one knew why. And I didn't brag about it.
Right.
I think that was something. There was a kind of this mysteriousness.
Yeah.
That people were just like,
that kind of helps in high school.
What the hell? And yet she's not getting in trouble for anything. She's not at parties. What's going on?
You're special.
I'm special.
So that even more alienation.
Yeah. And then in university, that was the best, was living in a residence, because that's when I realized that after being alienated for so long, I'm actually just like everyone else. Like all these girls have mustaches, and we all have issues with guys doing this. Well, it's just I don't know. It was awkward. I was isolated. From getting to know myself, because I was always comparing myself to others. Also, I think when you're put in a gifted program, you're kind of made out to be a bit more judgmental.
Also,
because I at least realized the teachers judging me differently than they're judging other people who are in the same program doing the same material. So we're all judging the work differently, and then being scrutinized differently.
That's true. Yeah.
Even if we get the same answer. So I just started getting into all these different eyeballs of judgment, and I lost my own self and my own, I became selfless.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's not the best. And I think maybe some of that had to do with my upbringing.
So you recognized yourself at that point to have lost yourself? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's an interesting realization to have at that stage in life. How old were you?
I think this probably happened between 10 and 12.
Wow. Yeah.
10 and 12.
That's a trippy kind of experience itself.
Yeah. And to tell you the truth, it honestly didn't come back until the car accident.
Oh.
So I honestly was a very selfless catering person who then realized, no, you're supposed to have a life, but because I was so used to catering to other people, and that meant dealing with a lot of chaos, I found comfort in chaos. And then I was living in a world of chaos.
Yeah.
And then the accident happened.
It regularized things quite a bit.
And it's a huge silver lining. And it's bumped some things into place. So my own research and inquisitivity with neuroscience and physics and philosophy, and dedicating my life to that, because I do have synesthesia, I should explore it.
Yeah, use it to your advantage.
Exactly. And, you know, the woman on TED Talks, the neurosurgeon who had a stroke and understood what was happening to her. She had a great talk on TED Talks, and I could connect to that story because when I had my brain injury and they're asking me 3 + 5, and I don't know, it's not there at all, but I know I should know how to do this.
Right.
And then healing from that and going through the process, it's been incredible. It's been
How
a journey.
How do you heal from that? So when you're in that state, so I'm familiar with that state, but it's fleeting in my case. You know, when I'm stoned or in a trip, I can get in that state of mind for like a few seconds or something. But are you saying that it persisted for, like, if 3 + 5, for example?
I wasn't able to do arithmetic, simple arithmetic, for about a year.
So how does that come back in from the cloud and the haze?
It's so difficult. Yeah. It comes and goes. I recently learned how to play a card game called... So one thing actually with brain injuries, our cards are very difficult, because with cards you have numbers, you have suits, and you have colors.
Right.
And those are 3 things you need to pay attention to. And then sometimes it's speed is brought into factor.
Right.
Sequence. Yep. Pattern. So it can become very discombobulating. A lot
of dimensions it's functioning on.
Yeah. And in doing occupational therapy, they would do very simple card games. But recently I sat down at a cottage and learned a game called Oh Hell, or is known as Whist. And that asks you to pay attention to the trump card, then also who's dealing, who plays first, who's bidding first. If you don't have the card that's being played, you have to play the trump card.
That sounds like a lot of rules, though.
There's a lot of rules, but it's all based on numbers, the suits and colors. And this was the first time since leaving neuro rehab where I felt completely incapable.
Wow.
And I got depressed and anxious and very self-conscious, because I went from being, you know, a confident survivor at a table to all of a sudden being like, I can't play this game at all. Wow. I can't even do the scoring. I can't do anything. And slowly practice and practice and practice.
Yeah, and when you're practicing, I guess it's experiential, but it's also you're changing your body through that practice.
Exactly.
Right. So your neurons are actually changing as you're doing the ideations and movements.
Yeah, it's sorting it in more finer lines instead of shuffles.
Right.
And
creating patterns.
Creating
and
patterns
that
and loops.
can be repeated.
Exactly.
Because they can be repeated, they're more solidified and they become a thing. So
there you go. And now I'm a really good whist player. So anyone want to play Oh Hell or Whist? I'm ready.
Never played. Yeah.
It's a lot of fun.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, as you describe it, to me it sounds like a psychedelic trip that you can't leave, in some sense.
It's completely like that.
Yeah.
You can't predict it at all. I still struggle with oversensory kind of meltdowns. If I'm very tired and I go somewhere where it's loud and there are a lot of people who I don't know and there's screens, and I definitely start to panic, and senses start to shut off or get scrambled, or become like static TV. And that's unfortunately, you know, after the accident, I became an agoraphobe. I didn't leave home for a long time. And that's because going outside and all the noises would cause my synesthesia. And one of the things I had to practice was reading in public, because just reading at home was an issue, just paying attention to a book and keeping the attention to the book. But then there was reading in a cafe, so there's some surrounding sounds.
More
and
challenging.
Then reading in a mall was the next one.
Step by step.
Step by step. The thing is, though, health in terms of sleep, diet, mental health, these things all have an influence on whether my symptoms come back or not. At this point in time, 2 years later, I think I have a sense of what I'm going to be dealing with. But that being said, the brain's a very marvelous thing. So,
no kidding.
And it heals in strange ways. And, I didn't know physics before, and now I do. So
excellent.
That's great. Yeah.
How do others describe you before and after?
So some people say, it's interesting. Before, I was a lot more social and going out a lot more, and a bit more of a party animal. Some people would have said I was a bit more self-destructive. And I was a social butterfly, and after the accident, I became a lot more focused on long-term goals and long-term life values.
Now, do you think that's something like neurophysiology, or is that just like a near-death experience kind of kicking the ass?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was a near-death experience. But what that did is that made me have to reevaluate the life I had before and who I was before. And so I had to change myself to some extent. So one thing is I became a lot more black and white with people. And people's behaviors. I don't tolerate abuse in emotional forms, whether in the workplace, from friends.
It's like you streamlined all that shit.
Yeah, it's shit. And I just don't want to deal with the shit anymore.
Right. Yeah.
There's been like enough through the fan. The fan's not working. It works, but I've turned it off.
Good.
And but it's still oscillating.
It's ready and moving.
Yes. Some people would also say that I'm more patient with myself, which has allowed me to explore the things that we've been talking about, to become more mindful and more inquisitive about physics and art, and portraying my synesthesia through my art, and spending time on that, because that's a narrative it's very hard. It's very difficult to try and share. And what's a little odd about me is I don't do it with the colors I see. I use black and white, because what I find so interesting is the dimensions and perspectives at which these colors come into my vision, and what manipulates those and what controls those. And I've already started finding patterns. And this is something I hope to write about in the future, because I think I'm just tapping into another loop that surrounds us, and that we can all relate to. And
I have one of yours on my wall here. Very trippy.
Yes. Lots of loops.
Lots of loops. Exactly. You can view them at different planes. Yeah. Very cool. So you have an art show that you're planning as well, aren't you?
Yeah, so I'm currently fundraising for an art show. I have a GoFundMe. I would like to do an art show where it's just my work, because I want to show how my brain's healed. And it's portrayed through my artwork. And it's shown through the amount of detail, the lines, the size, the types of materials I'm using, and the content that's portrayed. There's a story there, and the way I look at it is like an album that you have to listen to from beginning to end, because each song is part of a story.
Right.
And I don't want to chop it up and have it be shown randomly. So right now I'm working on raising money for that. Hopefully maybe have a pop-up here in Toronto. If I can't raise the funds, then at least do one night full exhibit and make a night of it, and puts a show on and let people appreciate and also enjoy the experience and story that I've lived.
Isn't it amazing though? Like, it's a kind of a silver lining approach to things. Is that sometimes I think of a kid that has a stuttering problem, for example. Because of that, becomes very aware of vocalization and takes lessons and gets really good at it and becomes a newscaster, like Walter Cronkite. So in a way, there's kind of that silver lining kind of happening with you in a way as well, right? Because you kind of became aware of how you are and what you are, you have to pay attention to that and actually consciously try and affect that. Which is a great skill to have that, I've been basically spending 50 years trying to figure that stuff out just by accident or sitting around and thinking or psychedelic trips or what have you. But you kind of get a head start on that. So
and this is something that's been said to me by a lot of older individuals is that like you've definitely, you're not 60 and realizing that you don't want to be sitting next to Bob at the lunchroom your whole life, and yet you have. Like you've really been given a new perspective and a good kind of push to go. And I also want to advocate for people who've gone through these experiences, and also for other people who have synesthesia. I think it's really important that they explore it, and that means exploring themselves and who they are and how they perceive the world and how they interact with the senses they have.
Yeah, this whole thing reinforces my notion that we're all kind of in a trip, a psychedelic trip, that it's just most of the people seem to be sharing the same chemicals and, substratum. So they're having a more similar trip.
Right.
Whereas some, in your case, for example, you're kind of on the edge of the experiential realm of these things. But we're all kind of tripping. It's just when it's different from everybody else's, it becomes an issue. So you kind of have to learn their trip.
Yeah, exactly. And hey, what better way through art? Like, come see the trip. Come check it out.
And art works that way, right? I mean, it's all, and like with anything, it's about communication. You make art for others to see. You talk so that others can, get your communication.
At least you can see yourself. I mean, there are times when I'm working on pieces and I realize this has been drawn upside down this whole time. And I had no idea. And I turn it over. I'm like, oh, there's a person. And okay, all done. It's very strange. So I don't know what's going on in my brain when I do that, but I've becoming more conscious of when I do that, trying to figure out what's going on.
I know exactly what you're saying.
And then also sometimes what would be great with this art show is to get feedback, because my artwork is very detailed. It's the kind of work that you got to look up close to it. You got to spend some time on it. And then you can zoom out and you see more and more and more. And I love seeing things that I never saw in my work that other people say they see. And sometimes that's kind of trippy too. That's super trippy, because then I'm like, was that
some part of you put that in there maybe?
Exactly. And then there are other times where like I did draw a jar. Why did I draw a jar? And I didn't realize that the penny's going to miss the jar if you actually did a line to see the angle of the throw. It would miss the jar. And why did this guy realize that? Because you've got your unconscious or non-rational cycles within you that are good at certain things. And they're behaving and functioning, and they have a voice realizing too.
And they take over your hand and they take over the art sometimes.
And so these are things I'm interested in. And maybe that's a little narcissistic. It's like, tell me more about myself. But I mean,
that's okay. Artists I mean, otherwise it wouldn't happen.
I guess, You
got to overcome that. It was hard for me, to be honest. What you just brought up is that I could never admit to being an artist, because to me it seemed like, it's kind of conceited to say that you want people to pay attention to what you made or did. But if everybody felt that way, nothing would get done.
Yeah. And to tell you the truth, if someone comes up to me and says, I think it's disgusting and I hate it.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Tell me why. And,
That's a great reaction.
like, I want to know why and how, and
It'd be interesting to find out what's going on. Yeah.
because I'm not making the art to be flattered. And sure, finance is great, but it's an expression, it's a storytelling, and it's a piece of me that I critique it, try and understand it. I don't understand it.
No. Yeah.
So,
different parts of us. Amazing. Thank you for the conversation, Kira.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in, and you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you. It was a
All
pleasure.
right. Let's do a high five here.
High five.
Right on. Thanks.
All right.